And in my opinion, what that seems to be doing is almost creating an environment where, well, because this business has 100 clients in this sector and this business has 10 clients in that sector, we're going to review company A, but not company B.
MSP regulation. A lot of you have heard about it, especially in the last 12 months, but very few of you may actually know what it means or know who the powers that be are and what are they talking about when it comes to MSP regulation. Well, it's a really important question. It's a really important discussion to have. There are not that many people out there who actually live day in and day out in their job in managed services dealing with issues like compliance and regulation. But today's guest does. And I've asked her to come into the MSP Zone podcast to talk about what is the average day in the life of a compliance officer in a managed services organization. What does an MSP who is servicing highly regulated vertical markets, what do they deal with day in and day out? What are some of their challenges? What are some of their opportunities? And what are some of the things that we as a profession could and should be doing in order to make cyber hygiene, cyber resilience across the board, across multiple regulated markets, a reality? To that end, I am very pleased to have joining the MSP Zone, Hannah Finley from E.O. Johnson. Hannah, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I kind of teased in the intro your role as a compliance officer, and probably not that many MSPs. The large ones, the more mature ones, certainly have a compliance person, or maybe they have a compliance team. Could you just give us, well, before we get there, describe, in a little bit what E.O. Johnson has been up to for the last, 5 decades? You guys have been around forever.
We have. So Emery O. Johnson, E.O. Johnson, founded the company in 1957. He essentially built it on the premise of treating customers the way that he would want to be treated. And the first product and service line for the company was E.O. selling 3M Thermofax copy machines out of the back of his car. And so that was really how E.O. Johnson was founded and got started. We are now a second generation family-owned business. So E.O.'s daughter, Mary Jo, is heading up the company, which makes us a woman-owned business enterprise. And we are a much different company than we were in 1957. Now we are, full managed print offering, IT services, digital scanning, digital mailroom, production print supplies. And we are also label printers, barcode scanning, and business consultancy. So there's quite a few services in the business technologies umbrella at this company, and it's really exciting to be their compliance officer.
A long way from the Thermofax days. I don't even, I vaguely know what Thermofax is, but I probably wouldn't, pass a test. But anyway.
Fair enough.
So now that we know, so the point is that you as a company have been around for a very long time through an acquisition and through just general growth and maturity. You have into the managed services industry many years ago, by the way. This is like 10 years ago, I think, or more.
Yeah, like 2011, 2012, circa that era.
Yeah. So you become a managed service provider, you evolve very rapidly in the managed services space, and then eventually they bring someone like you on board to be a compliance officer. In the modern day MSP, what does a compliance officer do?
Yeah, so a compliance officer is really going to be an internal strategic advisor. They're going to assist in complying with regulations, both directly for the business itself, but indirectly contemplating how the processes interface with its downstream clients, helping to author policies and procedures, train the workforce, keep ethics top of mind and make sure that we're doing the right thing in the right way out in the open. Compliance can really be whatever a company wants it to be. It's a pretty broad discipline, and depending on the flavor of the company, it can take a variety of shapes and forms.
Absolutely. And I know some very, very big, north of $1 billion revenue, MSPs out there who have, teams who do what you do.
Hmm.
But suffice it to say that you're focused partially internally, right, to
Yes,
the company, especially the service team. I know you work heavily with the service delivery, the managed services group in your capacity,
absolutely.
but you're also doing external communication with customers. Is that fair to say?
Yes, so there's been a handful of times where we have had to, really engage with our clients on how our processes help them meet or exceed certain regulatory frameworks, and helping them, really understand how the services interface with those requirements. We're the experts of our services, not the clients. And so even though the client may be the expert on their regulatory framework, they maybe can't always piece those things together in the best way. And so sometimes we have to help provide that sort of strategic alignment.
Hold thought on that one because we're going to come back to that topic in a moment. That's a biggie, right?
Mm-hmm.
The respective specialization zones between MSP and customer and where they intersect, where they overlap. Think of a Venn diagram. I think that that's a really fascinating and important topic. But before we do, we need to kind of set the stage. E.O. Johnson, in addition to being obviously very mature in its print and legacy DNA, but also the managed services, you focus on at least a handful of I would call them regulated markets. Do you mind going a little bit
Yes.
of detail who those are?
So our managed service provider division is heavily focused on the financial sector. We have a high ratio of financial institution clients as compared to, other client sectors in our stack. When you look at our print side and, other divisions, we actually see a pretty high ratio of healthcare entity and municipalities. So kind of a wide variety of regulatory frameworks interfacing with those services.
So for those listening and watching out there, when you say that, Hannah, I'm thinking the customer has oversight, and the
Correct.
customer's oversight extends to their supply chain, which would mean a company, a vendor like an E.O. Johnson, correct?
Yeah, so interestingly, for the banking sector, we have seen direct supervision applied by the FFIEC to our managed service provider division. And they're essentially citing that high permeation of banking clientele as their rationale. So our direct examination in the LockNet division includes representation from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve, and the FDIC, and they sort of rotate their lead examiner responsibilities. So we get to see all three of them approximately every 18 months. And then in between, we are having touch points with our lead examiner to kind of talk about changes in the business and, how day-to-day cyber attacks or other things might be impacting what we're doing.
When you say you get to see them, they are coming to
Yes.
you and saying we want to know certain things. I'm just trying to set the
Yeah.
tone for
So
everyone out there who isn't familiar with that.
they've definitely taken the tact of knock, knock, where the government let us in. And that's been an interesting dynamic because my formidable years have been in healthcare. And so having come from healthcare, it was very transparent and evident to me as a compliance officer, sort of which regulations applied and when, based on payer source, based on license type, based on a variety of factors. We kind of knew which arenas we were stepping into at any given point in time. And that seems to be a developing front in the MSP sector, in my opinion.
Undoubtedly, and we'll talk more about that in terms of where the U.S. and state governments are
Yes.
going in terms of that regulation trajectory. To set expectations or to provide additional clarity, E.O. Johnson, well, as a company, but also your managed services division, has been certified. You've been a Cyber Verify certified and SOC 2 Type 2 audited company for at least a decade or more. It's not like you are not transparent as a company. And so I'm trying to paint the picture for the audience that you go through not only an annual certification and audit by us,
Mm-hmm.
MSP clients, but you also have this multiple governmental agency review and oversight. The oversight is higher level, review is deeper level. So it's not like you guys don't have just a ton of people looking at poking and prodding, you might describe it. But I mean, could you talk about that dynamic of a
Yes.
self-directed, you go out and get certified versus government oversight? Because there's overlap, if I'm not mistaken.
There's a lot of overlap. And to use your comment about the Venn diagram earlier, in my opinion, there's more overlap than there isn't. Generally, in the IT space, and this is my opinion, not the opinion of my employer. My employer knows I'm here today, but all opinions are my own. We'll get that disclaimer in there. IT controls are relatively stable industry to industry. There's a lot of cross ties between the frameworks. You can kind of line them up and cross map them one to the other, and there are sort of core standards that they all have underpinning them. So to have multiple reviews, those that are, self-invited scrutiny, like you mentioned, and then those that are less invited scrutiny, does create a fair amount of administrative burden, in my opinion, because we're producing a lot of the same evidence for these audits, and it takes a lot of labor time to produce screenshots and, gather contracts that are being reviewed and, pull all those wonderful things that auditors want to see to evidence controls, because in many instances we're doing it multiple times. And so there isn't a lot of efficiency being gained in that model.
Yeah, and we've had these conversations, and I think that there is a very real likelihood that we could have a significant breakthrough with some of those regulatory bodies where we see some improvement, right? So that there is a easing of the burden on MSPs, because let's face it, there's a legitimate right of certainly the federal government and state governments in banking alone to
Mm-hmm.
have an understanding and a watchful eye on the security of the U.S. banking system. Would you agree with that? I mean, that's
I would
fairly
100% agree with you. Where I personally would sort of start to draw the line a little bit is that right does not necessarily extend to a picking and choosing of the application of the requirements. So it seems like there is framework being applied on the basis of scale. And in my opinion, what that seems to be doing is almost creating an environment where, well, because this business has 100 clients in this sector and this business has 10 clients in that sector, we're going to review company A, but not company B. And it causes some discrepancy in the industry. It causes some free market economy problems, but it also causes sort of a weighting issue for these clients, where almost like one client is being treated as more valuable and important than this other group of clients that's the same type and subjected to the same requirements. So that's where I personally start to have a little bit of an ethical dilemma with the
sure.
approach.
And for those of you who are not already in the U.S. financial sector, specifically banking, when we talk about, Wells Fargo and Chase Bank and Bank of America and all the top tier banks, I'm assuming, maybe you know this more than I do, but I'm assuming that the FFIEC and the FDIC and the state examiners are very, very, I would say that they're probably camped out in those banks. Is that a fair statement or
I mean, as a person who keeps their deposits in these financial institutions, yes, I would hope that there's a fair amount of oversight happening with
fingers
these larger,
crossed?
yeah, these large.
But that oversight would also extend to the service providers. And yes, even those large enterprise, multi-state, multinational banks do outsource, just like banks do to your company.
Yeah, I
There's
think
oversight
there's
there.
Sure. And I think there's sort of a difference between, maybe this is where the maturity doesn't quite exist yet, again, in my opinion. So there's a material difference between a third party to a bank who holds assets and deposits and invests them or holds them in some meaningful way for their customers. That's a different relationship than I'm a managed service provider who is helping to secure the bank's network and providing a firewall perimeter and not touching the banking core or any of the insured deposits, right? There's different third party levels of relationship. And I personally wholeheartedly think that the FFIEC should be scrutinizing any third party that's actually holding or managing funds on behalf of the institution. That makes complete sense to me. But where it starts to get a little feeling like square peg into a round hole is when we get into that MSP space where we're really not providing meaningful direct financial services. We're really starting to get more into the periphery at that point.
Where, yeah, so you're not, to be clear, you're talking about where there's a business line of application, let's say the Chase Bank or the Wells Fargo Bank application that actually runs the interface for users going in there. There's a lot of other infrastructure that doesn't touch that. Am
Sure,
I getting the drift there?
or like third party check depositing, where they're actually handling, the physical check and mobile depositing it, those sorts of services, or they're providing investment strategy for those assets. So there's a lot of sort of fintech type relationships that could occupy those space, but none of them are really in that managed service provider vein, in my opinion.
To be fair and give the flip side of the argument,
Yes.
from a regulator standpoint, if there is if there's the enterprise,
Hmm.
which I'm assuming has a very bright light shined on it right now, at all, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Then there's the mid market and there's the small and mid-sized business market in the United States, where those enterprise service providers will not, and historically have not, ever touched. Which brings up why companies like E.O. Johnson do exist, because you can effectively manage those kind of mid-level banks that none of the enterprises would touch. Agreed?
Hmm.
Disagreed?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. If I was a FFIC examiner, I might say, well, there's been historically a lack of transparency amongst third-party vendors, including some smaller MSPs who do touch banks, even in a limited way, according to your last definition, meaning they're not really touching the keys to the kingdom, so to speak. But there has been there's an opaqueness to
Yes.
who these companies are and what they're doing. Would you care to speak to that
Absolutely.
situation?
I love the flip side of this coin, right? Because I think the FFIEC was largely presented a vacuum. And the vacuum was, who's watching this sector? Arguably no one. So those who are self-directing are on the leading edge of the bell curve, and they're out there maturing their programs and doing the right things. But as with any bell curve, there's always a lagging end. And in the financial sphere, don't think that the examining entities are comfortable with that level of risk, right? So they want to make sure they are ensuring that the financial institutions are safe and sound. And that includes, from their perspective, these very critical third-party vendor relationships. So even though we're not holding deposited funds, we are a critical vendor of the bank. And in absence of the FFIEC having any assurance that these businesses are being overseen in some meaningful way, don't fault them for stepping in. And if I were on that side of the equation, I might have done the same thing.
Yeah. So again, if you're out there in Regulatorville,
Yes.
if you're one of these state or federal regulators, we appreciate the job you're doing. I think what we're trying to do is paint a very vivid picture for everybody out there, that there is the E.O. Johnson, there is the enterprise level class, if we can call it that, of oversight currently being performed. And then there's something else, which is everybody else that may touch U.S. banks, credit unions, fintech, et cetera, which historically just hasn't had that same level of a bright light. I always use a bright light,
Yeah.
right? Bright light meaning effective regulatory oversight.
Yeah,
Maybe
it
that's a
really
dumb.
starts to feel sort of like a patchwork quilt because we're sort of applying different lenses to different pieces, even though those pieces may be more similar than they are different. And so that's where it starts to feel inconsistent, less transparent, more difficult to maneuver. Businesses absolutely want to be innovative and creative and on the cutting edge in some instances of like really leading technological advancement. But we have to understand how those activities align with whatever regulation we may be subjected to. That story seems to be sort of being written as we're moving on that trajectory.
Along that theme, it would seem to me that in a regulated field like you are, that the E.O. Johnson sales team would have an incredibly easy job being able to take leading cutting edge technologies, particularly those in security and data privacy, data protection, to a regulated customer like a United States bank and say, you really need this. This is really helpful and it's going to make your life a lot better. Is it
Mhm.
that simple, or do they still give you pushback on, you know, that type of stuff?
Yeah, so I sort of wish it were that simple. But the reality is that there are a fair number of customers in the market, and this is their prerogative, and many businesses are like this, that are very price sensitive. And so, especially when you're on the emerging end of your compliance journey where you haven't quite figured out how to place valuation on compliance and compliance maturity, in that vein of customers who may be more apt to choose the lower cost providers simply because they're a lower cost provider, irrespective of whether or not they're the person best positioned to meet your needs on a forward going basis. And that's sort of where that free market economy comment I made earlier starts to come into play, because you and I both understand compliance is not free. Compliance costs rarely go down. Once you get into that vein, that space, you're going to continue to see spend. And ultimately that could impact pricing that customers see. So when they're comparing, two different opportunities here, they're potentially being faced with a very different price point.
To boil it down to a compliant driven MSP like a Neo Johnson and a, let's say, non-compliant driven, or at least maybe a MSP that, or it could be a break fix company. I mean,
Yeah,
let's not rule that
absolutely.
out. A provider of IT services of some sort, reactive or proactive, could present a low cost or a lower cost option. At some point, is the regulator not going to come in and say, no, this you can't not have multi-factor turned on?
I think that's the piece that remains to be seen. We're certainly out here seeing small providers who are not seemingly under any degree of oversight whatsoever. And I think that's where we've seen sort of that end value application of who's going to be reviewed in these various sectors. And so we're prioritizing the 100 over the 10, which, yes, in a pure risk model, that makes sense. But if we took a different sectors analysis for a second to kind of remove the emotion from it, if I had two hospitals and one has 10 deaths and one has 100 deaths, and I go, well, this one has 100 deaths, so I'm going to go review this hospital and not this hospital. But you find out that this hospital actually had a hospice program, and these were planned palliative care patients. And this other hospital actually had 10 medical malpractice cases that year, right? It doesn't scale purely on numbers. That's not the indicator that I feel can be used in our sector to determine who's in scope for some sort of review and who's not.
Point taken. And just so let the record be clear, this is not specific to banking, right? I mean, I think you brought up a couple of healthcare options or healthcare scenarios. This could apply to insurance, legal, transportation, local municipality, government, law enforcement, judicial, critical infrastructure such as
Yeah,
power, water,
100%.
many, right? I mean, this is not just
Yes.
a isolated incident of oversight and cyber readiness.
Correct. And in a vacuum of an adopted standard and approach, I think that our sector is potentially rife for that situation, because if I have 100 banks and that now means that the FFIEC is going to come in and review me, right? Okay, well, if I now have 50 clinics, does that mean that CMS is going to show up and knock on my door and want to conduct a review and make sure that we're handling, those relationships appropriately? And then it's 2 weeks until the Department of Transportation shows up because we have transportation sector clients. We simply can't move forward into the next decade and allow that to be the approach where these agencies are sort of picking and choosing how they're going to sort of upstream enforce into the MSP space.
What I'm going to ask a bit of a, it doesn't have to be a technical question, but what would you say to regulators about your opinion on what we should be doing as the MSP profession to better protect against cyber threats, which everybody knows they're out there and they're not just to the banking sector, they're to many sectors. What should we be doing? Like, what are the top two or three things that you think of?
Yeah, as far as like actually securing and hardening institutions, or as far as, sort of teeing up what that regulatory oversight and framework should look like?
It could be both, but I'm thinking of
Okay.
things that because what I've heard is the MSPs know what needs to be done. It's the
Yes.
customer, it's the client that is reluctant to say, I don't want to spend that this year.
Yes, fair comment. We still see a fair amount of resistance against MFA, and MFA being in our space, that's just it's very difficult to reconcile that, but it is still viewed by many institutions as a hindrance to their business and their business operations, sort of any sort of secondary checkpoint between me and the task that I want to do is burdensome and unacceptable. And there are still quite a few businesses and individuals who take that approach, right? You can see that play out in day to day where your aging parents are presented with the option to turn on MFA for their Gmail account and they just go, no, I don't want that. So certainly the MFA piece is there. I think for certainly maturing client bases, the biggest opportunity is really to partner more effectively with the MSP. And here's what I mean by that. Having a strategic IT plan and budget that you have communicated and developed with your provider will pay multiple dividends over the years. And I don't think that enough clients are really leveraging that option. Hey, I have, $10,000 or $25,000 that I'm willing to increase my IT spend by this year. What should I be doing with that money to best secure my environment based on my exposure and my current setup? Because for those who have adopted MFA already, right, that answer is going to be different. And so their MSP is going to be very well positioned to kind of help them drive that roadmap and figure out how to allocate those dollars to get the most bang for their buck, so to speak.
Yeah, I know there are MSPs out there listening and watching to this and saying, well, why don't you just upgrade your minimum level of managed service and just make that the baseline and then there's no option. I
Yes.
respect that approach, but I mean, maybe your thoughts on how that actually plays out in the regulated real world.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly used that tool. It is a tool in the toolbox. And as we move into the future, right? Like there was a point where seatbelts were not standard in cars, and now seatbelts are standard in cars. Like the baseline standard has to evolve and change. But there still needs to be scalability for clients to really elect and determine how secure they want to be, how much they want to invest into that IT security, cyber readiness, business continuity, because some businesses don't need as much. They just don't. And this really allows those businesses to be the driver and decide what makes sense for them.
I'd like to ask you a little question,
Yeah.
not to kick the MSP profession too hard here, but I get this a lot, and I'd like your 2 cents on this. I don't need to be certified. My MSP practice doesn't need to be certified because we don't host any data. Could you apply that to the modern day U.S. banking's oversight regulatory model and whether that would fly and why not?
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that sentiment. Um, I certainly think that MSPs are in a very unique position of trust. Day to day, we are frontline defense, like it or not. We're out here securing critical infrastructure. We are frontline to whatever cyber war we're in that day. And we are walking hand in hand with these businesses daily. So while their regulators may see them 1 or 2 weeks a year, or 1 or 2 weeks every 18 months, or 1 or 2 weeks every 3 years, depending on, which cadence we're looking at here, we're the ones that are beside them every single day. And I think that we have both an inherent duty and an obligation to be the best possible business that we can be as we are supporting these types of clients, because we are part of a broader ecosystem, and it's really part of being part of the American baseline, right? Like that's what it is. We're out here together managing that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the MSP, the modern MSP, is the first responder in the cyber war. Put differently, could your MSP survive the regulatory review that you go through absent your certification and audit? Like, would the regulatory oversight be enough to make them happy and just and smile and go away and see you next year type of thing?
Yeah, I don't know that our downstream clients fully understand the differences between those reviews. And so I will speak to the certification component briefly. In my opinion, the certification component is really where I see the client interests being delved into. So how are you communicating to customers, for an example, the geolocation their data? That's an expectation that we're working towards as a part of that certification. Personally, have not seen that question posed as a part of a formal regulatory review via another agency, although it is absolutely a question that our customers are interested in the answer to and have, multiple vested interests in making sure that they're on top of the answer to that question. So I do think there's value to that perhaps they're just not understanding, how they Venn diagram over the top of each other and what the differences really are.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought about that. I mean, you have customer questions from a compliance standpoint that are distinctly different than the compliance questions that the regulators have. I would
Correct.
think that they would be almost identical, but I
Not
guess they're not.
necessarily. Yep.
Yeah. From a transparency perspective and a regulatory perspective, the tides seem to have shifted just in the last 5 years. 5 years ago, maybe in the middle or leading up into the pandemic. I can't believe it's been so long.
I know.
There was definitely the MSP is a risk
Hmm.
feeling out there. You had major cyber insurance companies leaving the space in droves, and then maybe 12 months ago. I don't know when exactly it shifted, but the winds shifted to now there are cyber insurance companies re-entering the market with great vigor, trying to insure MSPs and their customers. But you also have public policy sentiment shifts, such as regulators who are now coming back to the MSPs and saying, no, no, we need you. You don't cause risk, you lower risk.
Hmm.
What brought that about? Assuming you think it's a good thing, how do we get more of that sentiment out there?
Yeah, I do think it's a good thing. And I agree. The sentiment very much, even 5 years ago, was MSPs are a risk. It was not, MSPs are a risk. And then there is value that they bring that could potentially offset all or substantially all of that risk, right? And now they're a value add. But there has been this awakening. I don't know exactly what the cause for this was. Do you think that we're seeing more conversation between some of the regulatory agencies and the MSP sector, where before that dialogue, I don't believe was occurring? I like to believe that CISA's approach to having a public private sector partnership on the books and out in the open has also potentially contributed to that. Sort of that we have to do this together. It's one part government, it's one part private sector. And without both parties really working in tandem together instead of, one enforcing its will on the other, right? It's a partnership strategically, that's how we're going to get through this.
Well, I think that I just thought of it. That could be very well the answer, right? The federal government may have just come to the realization that no, we can't isolate a very
Yeah.
critical part of the private sector. Let's embrace. So I'm curious, back to your question or your response, which is you've noticed a change in the regulators in terms of how they interact with you. Is it more collaborative, and if that's accurate way to phrase it, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think there has been a higher degree of collaboration. I want to say that, we've always enjoyed a respectful relationship with our regulators, even when they are challenging our viewpoint or asking us to think about something differently than we had been. It's always been a respectful dialogue. We've always had a good relationship with our examiners, and we respect them highly. But yes, I do think that there's an awareness that we are out here 365 days a year, and we're the ones who see these clients day to day. We see their decision making, we see their thought processes, we see which controls they've implemented proactively and which ones they haven't. We have been able to use our relationship with our examiners in a more consultative way. So you think about like the law firm who calls the FDA on behalf of their client and doesn't disclose who their client is and says, if my client were doing the following, right, would that be a problem? And, how would you want us to help them navigate that kind of thing? We can sort of offer that same blinded review advisement for our clients who are beholden to these standards and sort of get that consultative guidance when it's something that's perhaps on the fringes of the regulatory guidance. Like, how would you interpret this? How would you apply this? How would you review this process on examination? That we can be a more strategic partner.
Coming to the conclusion of this discussion, I know there's some MSPs out there saying, well, I have no intention of ever working with banks in the U.S. or any other bank, and I don't want to be hassled with that. I'm just, my customers don't care about compliance. My belief is that there could be a great amount of value that could be gleaned from some of the things that you've taken of a highly regulated managed services practice and applying those lessons learned and the IT service delivery principles and best practices you yourself practice to non-regulated markets. And curious as to your thoughts about doing that in order to protect them against pretty much the same, like almost identical commercial and nation state critical threats that they face. They don't know it yet, right? It hasn't
Yeah.
reared its head yet.
Yeah, exactly. As one of your previous guests, I believe, who had talked about, do I rob the 5 houses or do I go after the bank vault kind of thing? And the reality is very much that, yes, that happens. You can be an easy target and not be in the regulated space and not have any sort of oversight being applied to you nauseum. It doesn't change your risk level as a part of the ecosystem. If you are operating in the IT space, you have IT risk. The regulation and compliance piece is largely sort of secondary. Like that's a whole different vein of risk that needs to be considered. And so these non-regulated clients do stand to position themselves in a more secure way by leveraging these frameworks, by leveraging the expertise of these mature providers to really protect them and their businesses on a forward-going basis.
It could be that the federal government partners may start to get some positive feedback from, for example, the U.S. banking regulator sector about the changes, the positive changes that they're seeing, and take some comfort in that, and also take some wisdom from that and start to apply the same approach to other critical national sectors, some of whom may not have direct oversight, right? I think that's the threat today is
Yes.
A bank with federal and state legislative regulatory oversight is one thing. And adjacent to industry that does not still is an entryway, a door or a window into a sector that is quite interesting to some of those, bad actors.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why I think that the transparency and the consistent application, the understanding, how requirements will or will not apply, right? That's really how we get to a place where there's a consistency in the sector, irrespective of who's in the downstream client base.
Yeah, really, really critical. And I think there's a ton of work. I think there's a ton of work for all MSPs out there. And if you can take some comfort that it's achievable, I would like to say that, where you don't have to, be completely having multiple visits from federal and state regulators to be a good MSP, you could be a good MSP and still take some of the takeaways of best practices, good cybersecurity baselines, and take that to your customer base and just keep at it and keep working it, and it'll have an impact at some point.
Yeah, and I think it behooves the MSPs to be an active participant in that dialogue. The, hey, we're here. This is what we do. This is who we are. This is what we represent every single day. That's going to be really critical as we continue to move forward and sort of evolve the approach to the sector in total.
Absolutely. Well, Hannah Finley, thank you very much for coming on and explaining kind of the uh, the not so visible view of the MSP and the regulated markets. It's an interesting thing, and I think we're going to see a lot more of it, and a lot more MSPs are going to need to be aware of that type of what happens, because it's going to probably happen to them at some point, and they better be on the right side of that, and the wrong side. So appreciate your
Agree
input today.
wholeheartedly. Thank you for having me.